Thank you again very much to everybody for joining our Monday morning Miller-Johnson COVID-19 response team. It's getting very wordy, but COVID response team Monday morning roundup for April 19th, 2021. And for those who have joined before, you know, the goal of these Monday morning webinars particularly is to sort of take stock a little bit of what's happened recently, but also to look ahead on topics COVID-19 related and just sort of set the table for things to be aware of in your week ahead. And today's a pretty full schedule. We're lucky to have, well, I don't know if you're lucky or not to have me, but you have me and then 4 other Miller-Johnson attorneys here. And I'll let folks introduce themselves just in the interest of time. And my name is Erik Daly. I'm a corporate attorney at Miller-Johnson. And I've worked a lot on COVID-19 issues over the last 13, 14 months, mainly on the business side, things like small business administration funding, which will be one of my topics today. But I'm also a mergers and acquisitions attorney as well. So today's topics are, first of all, we're going to provide a rundown of what the state of the courts is in the state of Michigan in particular. It's been a dynamic last year. Then we'll pivot and talk about some of the implications of the Governor Whitmer's recommended 2-week intensive pause that was previously announced, and some of the fallout there and implications. New MIOSHA proposed rules and regs, and then an update from Tim Gutwald on our recent Michigan surge in COVID-19 cases and some of the related testing and vaccination ramifications. And then lastly, all time permitting, provide a brief overview of some official information that Small Business Administration put out over the weekend regarding the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant program that was authorized by the American Rescue Plan. So that's the agenda. It's a lot to get through. So I'm going to turn it right over to my colleagues on the litigation side to provide a state of the courts update. James and Sara, if you want to take it away, I'll go on mute.
Thank you, Erik. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sara Weskalnies, and I am presenting with my colleague, James Buster. James and I are both associates in Miller-Johnson's litigation section, and we'll be speaking with you today about the state of the courts in Michigan amidst this continued pandemic. Next slide, please. Without a doubt, COVID-19 has certainly changed the way Michigan courts conduct their business. But it is important to know that litigation has not come to a halt. Trial courts and appellate courts are conducting hearings via Zoom and telephonically rather than in person, which allows cases to continue moving forward, albeit at a much slower pace. Some court buildings are closed to the public or only allow visitors by appointment only. Many courts have different procedures than usual during the COVID pandemic. These procedures may include filing restrictions, limited public access to court clerks, more lenient scheduling orders, and of course, instituting remote proceedings. The common issue among this pandemic is certainly delay. Civil and criminal cases are progressing much slower than usual. And as this pandemic has evolved this past year, courts have responded to each surge in cases, which is something that we're experiencing now and what we have seen in the past back in November and back in May and April. So this map reflects the state of the courts as of March 4th, 2021. It's a little bit outdated as of now, as we know that cases have more recently surged. So this map shows how the courts are or have been responding to COVID-19 before this surge. The phases clearly vary county by county, and as you can see by the key to the right side of the slide, it shows by color coordination which courts are close to the public, which are open. Most courts are open with limited public access, as shown by the light orange color. Since the surge, many of these counties are likely turned red. A few courts in the UP are open with safety measures in place, which is shown in the green, which makes sense. The UP hasn't been experiencing such high numbering cases as the lower portion of the state. According to the key, purple designates that a court is fully open. As expected, no county on this map is purple. The most you're gonna see is green. Since the most recent surge, Kent County has reverted back to phase 1 and has closed its doors to the public as a result to the rise in the most recent cases. It's normal in this pandemic for courts to open and then close again for a period of time. We're experiencing it now. We saw it back in November. Courts are going to adjust their response to the number of cases in the area as appropriate. Kent County obviously is not the only court to respond to the surge. Kalamazoo County is open by appointment only. Ottawa County is also open by appointment only. Muskegon County has returned to phase 1. Jackson County has limited their access. And on the east side of the state, Genesee County has completely closed. If you want to know more about a particular court, the information is available on the court's website. Announcements of court closures and increased restrictions are also posted on the Court of Appeals webpage and the Supreme Court webpage as well. And with that, I will turn it over to James.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm James Buster. As my colleague Sara said, I'm part of the litigation department at Miller Johnson. My practice tends to focus more on commercial litigation and real estate litigation as well. But today we're talking about the state of the courts having dealt with COVID. As I don't have to remind anyone, about a year ago, a little before today, COVID kind of really came on the map with a vengeance. And to say that the courts and dealing with courts was a bit of a mess would be an understatement. We had courts closing, we had to figure out how to hold hearings, we had to figure out what deadlines and timelines would be given that mail was incredibly slow at the time. So let's fast forward to about a year. Courts have figured it out. They figured out that Zoom works. They now have the infrastructure to hold all kinds of hearings through Zoom. And they've been able to also even hold some trials, but we'll get to that in a minute. One of the implications of this, though, is that courts are still a bit backlogged on their dockets. So I have noticed that they're starting to do more rulings from the briefs. And what that means is they don't have an oral argument. Instead, you just submit your briefs and the judge just rules once they are ready to go. Although litigation has slowed, a lot of that tends to be at the trial level. Now that courts have become more comfortable with Zoom and that process, they have begun to issue scheduling orders that are relatively consistent with what was coming prior. There is a little bit more leniency, as Sara noted, in some of the deadlines. But now that litigants have become familiar with, for example, Zoom depositions, we've kind of figured out how long those things take, how to bring things together. Courts have figured out how to schedule the hearings. They've now started to issue scheduling orders that are somewhat consistent with how they were before, but it's at the trial level that things start to slow down. All right, so as I was noting, it's at the trials where things really start to slow down. So as all of you might know, if you've ever been in litigation, everything's kind of planned about a year out. A case might start in 2020, but it might not end with the trial until 2021, sometimes even into 2022. Well, as a result of COVID-19 and everything coming to a pause, all of those cases that would have had their trials in 2020 or maybe early 2021 are now going to be, for the most part, first in line in the rest of 2021 and 2022. So if a case is filed in 2021, but the courts are still dealing with cases from 2020, but the trial is not until 2022, you can see how that creates very much a backlog effect, and it can keep pushing things out. So at this point, jury trials, especially because of the surge, are almost non-existent in the state of Michigan. You will have some but some courts have gone an entire year without holding a single jury trial. However, bench trials are a different story. Bench trials are proceeding, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person. I have a trial on Thursday in person. I'm aware that there was a trial done by Miller Johnson earlier in the year that I believe was in person in the Western District Federal Court with plexiglass. I understand even some courts have tried to just move into bigger venues. So they are proceeding, they are moving forward. The courts I've dealt with seem to prefer in-person bench trials when possible, if for no other reason than it makes it easier to handle documents and to help things move more smoothly that way. And back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, James. One point I will say, I know Zoom has changed the way we conduct business. It's changed the way we conduct hearings, and for the courts that are brave enough to undertake jury trials via Zoom, it's certainly presented its own challenges and issues. One published article that I found in The Atlantic, which is titled, "Can Justice Be Served on Zoom?" gives a really great overview of the benefits and challenges of remote court. The article features comments by our own Supreme Court Chief Justice McCormick. It also provides really great insight into the impact that we're seeing now that may continue into the future. It deals particularly with issues with virtual jury trials. Some of the things that the courts are noticing is that jurors are seen exercising, sleeping, talking to people in the other room, taking calls, or leaving the camera to go get snacks. This isn't something that's certainly limited to virtual jury trials. I know litigators in our own section have experienced deponents during depositions getting up to go get coffee or even having Uber Eats delivered. So what we can say about Zoom is it's kind of taken what is a normally formal procedure and kind of adding some more comfort and informality to it, and figuring out how to overcome some of those issues is certainly a challenge, but nonetheless very interesting and entertaining. So as far as federal courts go, I don't think the federal courts have been experiencing the types of closures that the state courts have. I think they've been a little bit more active during the pandemic. 13 jury trials that were held alone in the Western District since reopening in May of 2020. One of those trials was a striker trial led by Miller Johnson's finest, I believe, Dave Gass, Jim Peterson, and Steven Stemport were the litigators on that trial, with Andy Portinga as a witness. If I left anybody out, I apologize, but I think that was the group. Some judges in the district are still holding in-person conferences and hearings, but it seems that is certainly highly dependent on the judge and the court as well. Not to be said, they're still experiencing a delay. There's still a backlog in cases, but I don't know if it's the same to the degree as state courts. The Eastern District as of now is closed to the public, but from my research, it appears the Western District is still open. So much like the circuit courts, the appellate courts have also changed the way they are serving both the public and conducting their business. Both the Michigan Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court have been using the Zoom platform to hear oral arguments, but unlike the lower courts, it does not appear that the appellate courts are experiencing the same types of delay or backlog. And this is likely because the appellate courts are not slowed by COVID-19 protocols like the trial courts are. The trial courts have to overcome issues that contribute to delays, such as jury trials and remote discovery, which simply does not exist in the appellate process. Appellate courts can efficiently use Zoom to hear oral arguments and move case call along. For the Court of Appeals, the remote platform will likely be the norm for some time. Until the court returns to the traditional in-person arguments, the court will continue to utilize Zoom for oral arguments on all cases where it is preserved. Recordings of all arguments are uploaded to the court's YouTube channel within 24 hours, but most Zoom oral argument sessions are not live streamed. So if you want to view an argument live, you can contact the court clerk's office at least 24 hours prior to the argument date. You can gain access to a link that way. The Michigan Court of Appeals continues to monitor events to determine when it is most appropriate to return to the courtroom. So they're constantly reassessing the number of cases, and they have a protocol that they use and guidelines that they use to determine whether or not it's going to be safe to reopen. And the Michigan Supreme Court operates similarly, except I believe oral arguments are streamed live on the Supreme Court's YouTube channel, which is the only major difference. And at this time, the Hall of Justice is currently closed to the public. So if you're filing anything, it is recommended that you leave it at the front desk. And that is it from me.
Thank you very much, Sara and James. That was, as a non-litigator, that was very helpful for me to understand kind of what's been going on over the last year and think about what the future of litigation may look like. So thank you for sharing that out. If people have questions, we're going to wrap up at the end with Q&A, and I think everybody will be able to hang in here with us on the panelist side. So just to keep things moving, I'm going to turn it over to Hillary Scholten to talk about topics 2 and 3. Hillary, if you're there, yep. I'll turn it over to you.
I'm ready. Hi, everyone. I'm Hillary Scholten. I am an attorney in our Labor and Employment section and also spearheading our new Government Affairs division. So I'm coming to you today with some updates on the governor's recommended 2-week intensive pause, which we are midway through, but we thought it was important to give some updates on that because we've got some insight about how that's kind of playing out. And then I'm going to talk briefly. There's been a lot of action and activity at MIOSHA. So give a brief update on that. Next slide, please. So let's first just take a quick look at the governor's 2-week intensive pause. So, if you've been paying attention to the minutia of the details about how some of these executive orders have come out, there has been a shift from Governor Whitmer issuing executive orders to MDHHS, issuing healthcare orders. This is an interesting update because it comes from both of them together. And it's not prescriptive, it is suggestive. They asked Michigan residents, K through 12 schools and youth sports programs to voluntarily follow restrictions for 2 weeks to shift high schools to remote learning, avoid indoor gathering with friends, avoid indoor dining at restaurants and diners, meaning specific note to choose outdoor dining and takeout instead, and suspend youth sports in-person activities, games, and practices. This runs from April 9th through April 23rd, 2021. Let's take a look at the next slide. So what is the deal with this shift? We saw at the very beginning of the pandemic, this intensive, we're shutting everything down. I think a lot of people saw the surge in cases, which I know Tim is going to talk about a little bit in the next slide, thinking, oh boy, here we go again, we're going to get shut down. Well, a lot has changed, one, in the legal landscape, and two, frankly, in the political landscape. And I think that we saw a governor taking an assessment of where we are and what may work best at this particular time, a year in, when we know more about how the virus spreads, we know more about where it is spreading. And, she herself has said that, we really want to make an intensive focus on personal responsibility at this time. This is an effort to try to impose voluntary restrictions before state mandated orders will follow. So this is sort of like a trial period. Can we get it done now? It also allows for a more focused enforcement effort to see where problem spots arise. We're not going to shut down all restaurants. We might shut down, restaurants in certain areas that are violating public safety protocols. So stay tuned. It'll be very interesting to see what happens at the end. I know, in a lot of hotspots, folks are not following the voluntary recommendations. Here in West Michigan, a lot of youth sports programs are still up and running. Restaurants are still offering in-person services. So I know we're all going to really just be watching very intently to see what happens. And of course, we'll bring you those updates at the end of this 2-week period. So there's been a lot happening at MIOSHA. First, we had an extension of the emergency rules, another 6-month extension, which would extend the emergency rules out until October 14th, 2021. At both in both the press release and at the press conference that the governor and MDHHS held, along with MIOSHA officials, they made very, very clear, almost awkwardly so, to say over and over again, this doesn't necessarily mean that these emergency rules will be in place for 6 months. They could be lifted if circumstances change. Additionally, as we're gonna talk about on the next slide, there are forthcoming permanent rules for how to deal with this. So, it's important to note that these can be modified or withdrawn at any time in response to changes in the COVID spread. It also doesn't mean that workers cannot work in an office or at a workplace, but there should be a need to do so, can't work from home for whatever reason, and office work must be conducted safely. And specifically, MIOSHA has required a return to work safety plan that individuals need to follow. MIOSHA has gone out of its way in public communication to say we're willing to work with employers to help you develop that plan. The extent of flexibility is subject to some debate. And they have made very clear that in the emergency rules, they are providing industry specific guidelines. So really trying to differentiate as much as they can between, what is safe for a factory setting versus an office setting, versus a construction site. So hopefully we will see some of that borne out as we get to more permanent rules, which leads me to the next slide. So proposed permanent rules, MIOSHA has issued them. They were issued last week. Some of you may have heard that there is a separate working group working specifically on in-office settings, a return to work group on office settings. If that happens to be your business, we here at Miller-Johnson are preparing some comments for the return to work working group. Those specific rules have not been published yet. Those are going to be a separate set of rules. They're forthcoming. There is a public working group. The names of the individuals on that working group have been published. We're in contact with that group and are going to be, issuing some advice to them about, while those particular rules are being promulgated. But in terms of industry-wide proposed permanent rules, those were conducted by a separate advisory group. They were issued last week. There will be in accordance with the Administrative Procedures Act, there will be a public hearing on May 26, 2021. Of course, it is going to be via Zoom like everything else. Public comments are being accepted now through May 26. I know we've already had a number of clients reach out to us requesting assistance in preparing a comment for that. Getting that in there, making your specific situation known for a comment on the rules. We are going to have a full analysis and an assessment of the proposed rules at a separate webinar this Thursday. It's obviously just a lot to get into, and we know your time is limited each and every morning. So we're going to cut out some time on Thursday morning to really delve into that, myself and my colleague, Sandy Andre. But ultimately, Michigan is going to follow what the federal rules say once those are issued. We know that those are imminently forthcoming. The state of Virginia was the first in the country to finalize their rules and sign them into law. And it's widely expected that the federal government is going to follow Virginia's rules. So far, we'll discuss this more on Thursday, Virginia's rules are a little bit more suggestive and permissive than they are prescriptive, the way that Michigan has tended to do things. So, that all remains to be seen. But if we do get federal rules, these Michigan rules, in all likelihood are going to be rescinded in place of just following what the federal rules have to say. So again, we'll delve into that, into the details a little bit more on Thursday, but that's the 10,000 foot view. Feel free to reach out to me directly if, for some reason you can't make Thursday, but you want the materials or you have other questions in the meantime. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Hillary. Very helpful as always. And I'm not going to pause right now for Q&A, although I do see that there are a couple of questions that we may circle back to, or
Sure.
which may be addressed directly in the Q&A box. But to be mindful, we're almost at 8:30. I want to keep things moving to, and thank you again, Hillary. That was great. I want to kind of along the same lines, but coming at it from maybe a slightly different angle, turn it over to Tim Gutwald to talk a little bit about this latest surge and testing and vaccination implications. Tim, if you're available, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Erik. To follow up on what Erik had said, this will be a little bit less legal related than some of our other presentations so far today, and kind of just more of a current events sort of aspect of the presentation, talking about the cases surge. Again, it began about 6 weeks ago. We'll see on one of the other slides some of the numbers in graph form. The daily cases peaked on April 12th with 7,545 confirmed cases. Again, this is pretty comparable, but not quite as high of a peak as what we saw back in November. We do have the highest rate of new infections in the country at about 510.5 per 100,000 citizens. And I think this is why, despite Michigan, our peak not being quite as high as it was in November, I think that's why Michigan is getting so much attention, because as compared to other places around the country, we're really a pretty significant outlier. As you see there, the next highest kind of rate of new infections is in Minnesota, which is almost half, just a little bit over half of what we have. If you tuned into Governor Whitmer's presentation and the presentation of some of the public health leaders last week, one of the things they pointed to as to an explanation for the current outbreak is the high prevalence of the B117 variant here in Michigan. It was, many, many months ago that we mentioned that this was first found here in Michigan. I believe it was in Washtenaw County. And now you can see here that over half of the new cases that we're seeing here in Michigan are from that variant. And just as a reminder, that variant is the general scientific consensus is that it's more easily spread from individual to individual. You're also seeing, though, the national average is still pretty high there at 44.1% for this new variant. But again, Michigan is an outlier, and I think that's why we're seeing so much attention here in Michigan. And this just kind of provides you the visual of where we are. You'll see there on the slide, you can kind of see that big surge in November into December. We're not quite as high as there, but it's a fairly similar shape. And then the graphical presentation below kind of shows you when that surge began. Back on May 7th, we were on March 7th, we were, real low again into February. And then it's just been a steady climb week over week, beginning in March 7th and then through this last week. It'll be interesting. You kind of see that drop off there. It's common to see a drop off on the weekend. People are less likely to go out and get tested. But here in this last week, you can see that there was just a steady decline in the number of cases. So it'll be interesting to see if that's vaccines or people taking additional precautions, or if it was just sort of an outlier and we're going to see that spike back up again. I'm sure it'll go up, obviously, from that last bar at the very bottom, but maybe fingers crossed, the surge is dying down a little bit. Obviously, one of the important components anytime you see a surge is to talk about testing. The number of tests have been stable. I know, or especially earlier on in the pandemic, we would hear a lot of, oh, you see these number of cases, it's because tests have increased. And as you can see here, there's 58,000 tests administered on the 16th, but that's not quite as high as we had in back in November, actually fairly, a significant amount lower. And if you see in the sort of graph below, the table below, you can see that, testing has been fairly standard since kind of that November surge, other than a few outlier days where we had some significant testing. It's been kind of around that 50,000 mark or so. One thing obviously we're seeing is the 7-day positive rate is over 14%, which is obviously quite significant, quite high, and not what we like to see, but that's what you sort of expect with a surge like this. And that's, that positive rate has been climbing since that sort of early March beginning of the surge. Obviously, where can you get tested? As we're in the surge, people are going to, end up contracting, or, if before they come into work, if they feel like they have a symptom or two, they're going to want to get tested. MDHHS has a very helpful website that identifies places where people can be tested. Individuals, MDHHS has a testing site at Garfield Park Gym. Again, they also just recently started up this pop-up site. So this is the rapid antigen testing. So the results come back immediately, which, as someone who has had children tested a number of times in order to avoid spreading anything to schools, I've taken, kids to get my children to get tested, and then you got to wait a couple days to find out if they are or are not positive. And that can be, difficult, especially if you have both parents working. So these pop-up sites are quite nice. I will put a link in the chat to the MDHHS website for those pop-up sites. You can search for locations near you. The other option for our clients, business clients on the line, there's an email address in there where if you want to participate and operate and host a pop-up site, you can do so and email them and express interest and work with them. And if you have questions about that, I know Hillary's quite familiar with that pop-up program, and so either contact Hillary or me, and we're happy to kind of help you work with MDHS to make that happen. Cherry Health has a site for testing as well, and then the health systems around here in Grand Rapids and in other locations, Mercy Health, Spectrum, Metro Health, all have testing. Physician offices, pharmacies like Walgreens, CVS, Rite Aid, and then there's other entities. One of our clients, Health Bar, has a drive-up testing site over on Michigan, and other entities have similar testing options as well. Some healthcare providers perform on-site testing as well. Talk to your Miller Johnson employment lawyer if that's something you're considering, and feel free to contact us, and we can help you, get that set up and navigate some of those legal issues that might pop up if that's the route you want to go. Vaccines, obviously, the biggest news with respect to vaccines over the last week was the pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which occurred on April 13th of 2021. There was a statement by the FDA and CDC issued that same day. That statement pointed out that there had been 6.8 million doses administered of that Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and they had seen 6 cases of a rare and severe, type of blood clot as a result of that. All 6 of those cases had occurred in women between the ages of 18 and I believe it was 48 or around 50. So there was a pause. Obviously quite a bit of controversy about that. The next step was for the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, also known as ACIP, they met that very next day to look at the data. People had all sorts of opinions, I guess. And what they ended up doing was declining to end the pause, saying that they needed to review additional data before making any sort of recommendations. So they are currently doing that. There's a meeting scheduled for April 23rd of the ACIP committee where they could, 1, continue the pause, 2, modify the FDA's authorization, or 3, they could rescind the pause. I would point out that, as far as good news on the vaccine front, if you looked at the numbers, I believe over the weekend, I saw some information saying, over 3 million people were still vaccinated on Sunday. So despite us being down to 2 vaccines as opposed to 3, there is still, 3 or 4 million people are being vaccinated a day. I was perusing Twitter this morning and I noticed that based on numbers, it looks that just over 50% of the adults here in the United States have now received at least 1 shot. So the good news is that progress continues to be made on the vaccination front, even if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is presently paused. So we'll obviously provide an update when the ACIP committee makes a decision later this week.
All right. Anything else, Tim, that you wanted to get to? That's pretty, it's pretty remarkable. Every time I think about the vaccination news and the fact that there are 3 different vaccines, kind of marvel at scientists and healthcare workers. But before I launch into the restaurant revitalization fund update, is there anything else, Tim, on your front?
No, well, I will say, for people that are on the webinar that don't know me, I practice, in the healthcare law field. And I did want to mention that the FCA, so there's been a fair amount of funds within the healthcare field, and there are some additional funds made available for telehealth. So if people if there's any clients who are looking to access some additional funding to help spin up their telehealth practice, please, reach out to me. We can help you submit that application to the right entities. So thanks, Erik.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Great point. All right, now we're going to change gears quite a bit. We've got enough time to go through this. I originally thought, and it will be a relatively brief update. I originally thought I would not be presenting this morning, but the Small Business Administration launched some public information and a new website about Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant program over the weekend on Saturday afternoon. One thing I'll say at the outset is, though, this is obviously most relevant to restaurants and food service businesses. The use of the funds, the permitted use of these grant funds, is so broad that I think it actually impacts many more businesses. For example, construction businesses. Anybody who works with PPE, personal protective equipment, arguably healthcare workers, and anybody providing any kind of a service to a restaurant or a food service business probably wants to know at least a little bit about this program. So I'm going to go through this, and again, we'll circle back for questions on other topics. But as I said, over the weekend, SBA launched this new landing page for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which had been previously created or authorized by the American Rescue Plan Act. And basically, the idea is that the fund will provide restaurants and other eligible businesses, which we'll get to on a later slide, with grants that can be used for very diverse and broad purposes based on their revenue loss in 2020 compared to 2019. And there's cap of $10 million per business when you include all the affiliated restaurants, and then also a $5 million per location cap. And when you think about the number of restaurants there are in the country, it's, even I can do the math that there's probably not going to be enough funding for all the restaurants. So either the program's going to run out of money and not everybody will be funded, or Congress will appropriate more money to continue the funding, and we'll keep people posted on that. But for now, I believe it's a $28.6 billion program overall. And restaurants and other eligible businesses had until March 11th of 2023, so quite a long time to use the funds. And while the SBA is not accepting grant applications yet, its website, which is noted above, does describe in some detail what the grant application process will look like, and provides quite a lot of information about what applicants will need to provide to SBA in order to apply. Eligible grant recipients obviously restaurants, as I mentioned at the outset. But then there are some in here that, you know, especially for Michigan, may not have jumped out, may not be the most obvious when you think about restaurant revitalization fund, but things like brew pubs, tasting rooms, tap rooms, microbreweries, wineries, distilleries, as long as on-site sales of food and beverage, you can see that red asterisk on the bottom, were at least 33% of gross receipts, which is basically gross revenue under the SBA rules. But others that I wanted to call out just in general are caterers, not a restaurant, but a food business that would qualify for this program. Bars, saloons, lounges, taverns, so kind of watering holes, snack and non-alcoholic beverage bars, maybe a coffee shop or a coffee bar, and then even things like food trucks, food carts, food stands. So yeah, it's a pretty broad program, and there are some additional requirements and limitations, but in the first instance, it's quite encompassing for potential eligible grant recipients, which is one of the reasons it's likely to run out of money before everybody's funded. In addition, if you're a type of business that's located in an airport terminal or that operates within another business, so for example, a restaurant that's within a hotel or conference center, that would also be, as long as it's operating separately and has its own EIN, tax ID number, that business would be eligible, as long as, and all the applicants must certify that current economic uncertainty makes the funding request necessary to support the ongoing or anticipated operations of the applicant. That's basically the same standard that was required in the PPP loan context. It's actually working a little bit differently towards or anticipated operations. We don't need to get into why that might be, but it's important to know that, you know, even if you qualify because you had a revenue decline, you still need to make this certification, which you know, we recommend anybody who's applying for these types of government loan, subsidized loans or grants, that they keep a good file of, you know, their need for the loan of any size until the government tells you more specifically what you might need to provide to justify that. So again, just kind of taking a step back before we move forward here. On that first bullet point, I looked at the roster of attendees today, and people may view this later on YouTube or otherwise. And even if you're not a restaurant, again, if you're a venue that has a restaurant within it, some kind of coffee shop or a restaurant in a hotel, you know, you want to make sure that those operators, who are busy people, of course, and dealing with a lot of the state voluntary guidelines, MIOSHA rules, things that Hillary talked about earlier, and maybe dealing with employees who are getting tested or vaccinated, like Tim said, you know, call it out to their attention, because you know, then you can help them be a good, you can be a good partner, make sure they get some grant funding that they're eligible for. That's good for everybody involved to keep things operational. All right. So we started off from the premise that the program is broad, a lot of eligible businesses. There are categories of ineligible recipients that whittle it down a bit. Public companies or publicly traded companies are not eligible to receive these grants. And for example, you might remember back about a year ago with the PPP, there were some publicly traded companies, including one large national restaurant, like sandwich restaurant chain, that applied, returned funds, and then reapplied. In this case, that can't happen, at least with respect to public companies, because they're categorically ineligible. And then, I guess along the same lines, but you know, much more granular, is any business that together with affiliates owns or operates more than 20 locations, also ineligible. And it doesn't matter whether those locations are all under the same brand or not, or the same franchise, same name. If you have 20 locations or more, including your affiliates or majority-owned companies, which is slightly narrower definition of affiliate in this program, also ineligible, too large to participate for this program. And then if you're a business that received shuttered venue operator grants, so you can imagine some businesses might qualify for both programs, right? If it's both a restaurant or some kind of business like a dinner theater of some kind, where there's a food service element plus a performance involved, you can't get both. You can only get one of the two types of grants, shuttered venue or restaurant revitalization fund. State or local government operated restaurant or food related businesses not eligible. Not-for-profit organizations apparently ineligible. I don't believe that's in the statute, but it's in the information SBA put out over the weekend. Businesses involved in bankruptcy proceedings are probably ineligible. That is consistent with the rules for the PPP and the shuttered venue operator grant program, although I'll put an asterisk by that in case you're like a bankrupt business that's operating under a court-approved plan. You may be eligible. So not quite categorically ineligible, but probably ineligible. And then lastly, if you're operating a franchise, there are special rules that apply. You may need to work with the franchise or company. So like a lot of large national chains, obviously there are smaller businesses that are operating one or more franchises of that larger national chain, and there will be work done to make sure that basically, for example, if you're a publicly traded franchise, say McDonald's can't apply for a grant, but if you're a franchisee and you're operating fewer than 20 or fewer McDonald's, you're probably going to be eligible as long as you can make the need certification and you follow through with the SBA to make sure the franchise is properly registered and all that. So you just need to be mindful of a few additional hoops to jump through there. How to prepare. Review the materials on the SBA's website that I linked to earlier. It's really easy to find. It's like, I believe you can just do restaurants.sba.gov as well to get there. And they've made available a program guide, which is actually reasonably helpful. And, I don't say that to be condescending about the work that SBA is doing. They've been trying to administer literally hundreds of billions of dollars in funding, which is many, many multiples of what they have historically done pre-pandemic. And so their efforts have been significant. But this program guide is good. It's useful for the first go here, and I'm sure it'll evolve just like other SBA related materials have evolved over time for these programs. And then basically, like with all these programs, the more work you can do now before the application opens, the better. So collect information about your 2020 and 2019 gross receipts. I've listed some sub-bullets here of the types of information that might be helpful for that. And in particular, here I've underscored at the bottom, monitor your point of sale system partners updates, because SBA is working with those point of sale system partners. So like Square, if you go into a coffee shop and you pay with, one of those tablets that they spin around and you put your credit card in. And so those types of systems, they're going to try to facilitate importing a lot of that information that's required through those partners. So keep an eye out. You'll probably get a message from your partner on that front. If you don't work with any of those partners, then you got a little more legwork to do to collect the required information. And I'd also recommend subscribing to the SBA alerts, email alerts you can easily sign up for, so you can know on Saturday when the restaurant revitalization fund info comes out. How to prepare. I'll kind of go through this quickly. Basically, a couple of things to be aware of in terms of prioritization of funding and certain set-asides. So if you're a restaurant that is majority owned by women, veterans, and/or, probably should have said and/or socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, that business will be eligible to apply during a priority period. So there will be a test period for this program of about a week, and then they're going to launch the actual priority period, which is a 21-day window where only those underlying types of businesses here will be funded. Although anybody can apply during that period, not everybody will be funded. Only majority-owned restaurants that are majority owned by women, veterans, or socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. And it can be a combination of those, which is why I said it probably should say and/or. So it could be 25% owned by women, and then 30% male veterans. That'd be 55% total. You can't double count kind of a woman veteran as both. But anyway, there's some technicalities there, but especially if you're in one of those priority groups, you want to make sure you're ready to apply early on and don't miss that priority period, because as I said before a couple times, the funding will not last for this program, almost certainly. And then here at the bottom, I've just listed a few of the set-asides. So there's some tiered portions of the overall $28.6 billion in funding that are set aside. I won't go through all this, but the aim is, of course, for some of the quote-unquote smaller restaurants to make sure that there's pools of funding set aside for them, given some of the controversy around early access to PPP loans and things like that have occurred over the last year. I'm not going to go through this in detail. If you're watching this later on YouTube or something like that, you can kind of pause here to look at the different calculation amounts for grants. But basically, there are three groups. The first is the easiest. That's if you were operating throughout all of the last few years, you were literally just looking at your decline in gross receipts, and then you reduce that by any PPP loans you received to get your grant amount. And then it gets a little bit more complicated if you started business in 2019 or 2020, and that's where the second and third calculations come in. I won't go through that now, but again, this is all detailed on the SBA's website, along with the application form and program guide. Here are the allowable uses of grant funds, which is, again, one of the reasons why I think this is relevant for more than just restaurant businesses and food service businesses, because they're so broad, right? So if you're a lender to a restaurant, there are certain debts that can be repaid using these grant funds. If you're a landlord to a restaurant, some of these funds can be used to repay rent, and it can be done retroactively. Can't be done to prepay rent, but you can pay back due rent. Utility providers, maintenance expenses, construction of outdoor seating, and then there's like a very kind of open-ended item at the end for just general, reasonable, and necessary operating expenses. So again, just underscores that, one, if you're a grant recipient, you have a lot of flexibility to work with in how you use the funds. But two, if you partner with a restaurant, you want to make sure they're aware of it, because once they receive the funds, then they can use it to work with other vendors, or obviously fund employee costs, including sick leave and a variety of things that just kind of benefit the whole ecosystem. All right, that's all I wanted to get to today for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, and it's 4 minutes to 9, so we came in under time. I will stop talking. There are a couple of questions in the question field, which we may just follow up individually, unless anybody among the panelists would like to address those. And you can feel free to interrupt me if that's the case, but otherwise,
I don't mind just sort of. Oh, sorry, Erik. It's Hillary. I don't mind just briefly saying, with both of those questions, it really is, it's going to be case by case. To the question about the 2 to 4 good faith effort. It's very interesting when you mandate a good faith effort. I think that's a great question about enforcement. One of the things we've heard a lot recently is a dispute over how we got here to these rising case numbers. A lot of people say, we have an enforcement problem, and other folks say we have a compliance problem. So, I think we've seen a real trend from the executive to say, we're really relying on personal responsibility here. The short answer is, the rule itself does not contain an enforcement mechanism, but just like all of the other public health measures, it is written as a requirement, but the requirement is simply a good faith effort, and that's not further described. So, as you're creating, your COVID safety protocols, you may want to have some conversations, with your employment lawyer here at Miller Johnson about, what that looks like, or, individual issues as they arise.
Right.
And then, yeah.
Thank you.
I want to say more on that, Erik.
No, I was going to say thank you. I agree. I come at it from a slightly different angle, but there's a lot of good faith certifications required for being eligible. There was one that I mentioned for the restaurant program about necessity of the grant, and coming at it from that compliance angle, the only thing I would add is just creating a record, a non-privileged record that shows you considered different issues is always a good thing. You don't have to go overboard, but a good faith, as it's worded, attempt to balance those considerations.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
just quickly.
Sorry, go ahead, Hillary.
No, I was just going to say, just very quickly on that second question about bringing folks back under the emergency extension for folks who had been vaccinated and others not. So the rules are literally just putting out another extension of the October 2020 rules. And if you look at the preamble, it actually says there's currently no COVID-19 vaccine. So, the short answer is the rules don't anticipate this, exact scenario. But what they do, the answer really is that it's going to depend on the type of work that is done. The rules are really focused on the level of risk that individuals experience based on industry, based on proximity of contact. And I think, again, that's going to be borne out in your return to work safety plan. And that's something that you could discuss with your individual attorney. But these new 6-month extensions actually don't take into effect the fact that there has been a vaccine. So, that of course would decrease the risk under certain circumstances, but depending on the industry, have a conversation with your attorney specifically about that.
Great. That's a really interesting point, Hillary. Thanks for answering those 2 questions.
Sure.
And thank you to all the panelists, but more importantly, thank you everybody who tuned in today and before. It's so gratifying to see people continuing to engage with us. As I always, whenever I get a chance, I kind of wrap up these webinars, just emphasize that your involvement does really makes us better attorneys, more tuned to the needs of clients, the community. So please, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. That's not an empty gesture in the slide. So you can go back and see the contact info, and stay in touch. Stay safe, stay healthy. Have a great week. Take care.